G'day everybody, Sean from Bourbon Brothers here. Welcome to our April tasting videos. We're looking at the amazing Maker's Mark Distillery. Maker's Mark origin began when T. William Bill Samuel Sr. purchased the Burke's Distillery in Loretto, Kentucky for $35,000 on October 1st, 1953. Production began in 1954 and the first run was bottled in 1958 under the brand's dipped red wax seal. After the brand's creation by Bill Samuels Sr., its production was overseen by his son Bill Samuels Jr. until 2011 when he announced his retirement as president and CEO at the age of 70. His son Rob Samuels succeeded him April 2011. The distillery was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on December 31st, 1974 and designated a National Historic Landmark on December 16, 1980, listed as Burke's Distillery, the first distillery in America to be recognised while the landmark buildings were in active production. In the 1960s and 70s, Maker's Mark was widely marketed with the tagline, "It tastes expensive and is." Bill Samuels Sr.'s quest to create Maker's Mark began with his only copy of the family's trusted 170-year-old recipe, the one the sixth generation distiller promptly set on fire, of course. After accidentally burning a set of drapes in the process, Bill experimented with different flavouring grains, searching for a mash bill all of his own. To save years of aging time, Bill baked several loaves of bread with various grain combinations instead of distilling them. His quick thinking not only saved time, but also led him to swap out the traditional rye grain that is commonly used in bourbons for soft red winter wheat. This replaced the hot bite of rye with the delicate sweetness that Maker's is known for today. Maker's Mark is one of the few distilleries to rotate the barrels from the upper to the lower levels of the aging warehouses during the aging process to even out the differences in temperature during the process. They're also one of the few American distilleries to use the Scottish spelling of whiskey without the E as opposed to the traditional American whiskey. Soft red winter wheat is the Maker's Mark flavouring grain and the star of its mash bill. In a day when distiller's rye, which can have an unwanted bite, was the go-to grain for whiskey makers, Bill Samuels Sr. set out for a flavour that would let his new bourbon stand out in the crowd. After some trial and error, he discovered exactly what he was thirsting for. The Limestone Shelf where the distillery is located is key to crafting the unique taste of Maker's Mark. The only distillery with its own water source and watershed. Kentucky limestone filters out the iron from the water, which is unpleasant in bourbon. The pure calcium and magnesium-rich water surrounding the distillery makes better drinking water and a better sour mash in which the yeast can flourish. Sometimes the best, freshest ingredient available is an heirloom yeast strain that's more than 150 years old. In fact, this highly guarded microorganism has been passed down to every bottle of Maker's Mark ever produced. Would it have been easy to switch to a cheaper stock yeast when everybody else was? Sure, but it wouldn't have been better and it wouldn't have been Maker's Mark. The yeast ferments in tanks that are original to the old Burke's Distillery that predates Maker's Mark. They're made from cypress planks more than 100 years old. Hard to source these days, cypress is ideal because it has no effect on the flavour of Maker's Mark. It takes just 40 seconds of fire to achieve Maker's Mark customary number 3 char. The process of firing the barrels opens the pores in the staves and caramelises the natural wood sugars. This helps give Maker's Mark those pleasant vanilla notes. But before the firing can happen, the cooperage must season the new American white oak used in their barrels outdoors for 9 months, including over the summer. This helps remove the bitter tannins in the wood that would otherwise go into the bourbon. They rotate those barrels from top to bottom. The barrels spend a minimum of 3 hot Kentucky summers in the top of the rickhouse, where the whiskey expands through the woods, gaining colour and flavour, and then the tasting panel at Maker's determines when the whiskey is ready to move to a cooler section, keeping it from maturing too quickly. When Bill Samuels Sr. was developing Maker's Mark, he had a co-partner in crime. The co-founder, Margie Samuels, wanted to ensure the bottle was as pleasing to the crowd as the flavour of the bourbon. It's said that Margie is the reason most folks buy their first bottle of Maker's Mark, and Bill is the reason they buy their second. The shape of the bottle, the look of the label, the signature red wax topper, and even the name itself are all thanks to Margie. The Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Famer, the first woman involved with the distillery to be inducted, hand-dipped the first bottles in her kitchen using a home fryer to melt the wax. While Margie's fried chicken was never quite the same, neither was the whiskey business. While every sip of Maker's tastes just like the one before it, no two bottles are exactly alike. Those red tendrils of the wax give each bottle its own unique finish. When naming the new bourbon, Margie was inspired by the Maker's Mark that pewter whitesmiths put on their best work. Her mark features a star for the Star Hill Farm, the Bardstown farm where the family resided. Margie's S is for Samuel's, and the Roman numeral 4 symbolises her husband's status as a 4th generation distiller. Son Bill Jr. later discovered his father was actually a 6th generation distiller, but the SIV stuck, and it's there to stay. Margie sure knew how to make distillery visitors feel at home. Some even credit her with inventing bourbon tourism. Margie ensured the distillery would receive the same attention to detail as the whiskey, from its picturesque landscape to its distinctive red shutters. Margie even made Bill Sr. agree that for every dollar that went into the bourbon, another would go into restoring the distillery's buildings and grounds. If character came in a bottle, it might look something like this one. Margie's signature red wax topper isn't the only feature that helps Maker's Mark stand out from the crowd. The shape of the bottle, look of the label, and even the name itself are all thanks to Margie, the marketer. That square shape was inspired by Margie's collection of 19th century cognac bottles, as was the wax that typically seals them. Similar to how it was in Margie's kitchen all those years ago, Maker's Mark is hand dipped in 400-degree red wax. You can still check out the various dipping styles of the folks on their dripping line, from the skinny dipper to the no-nonsense dunker. You can even express your style by dipping your own bottles of Maker's Mark at the distillery if you go on a tour. The Maker's Distillery and brand have had its fair share of owners through the years. Maker's Mark was sold to Hiram Walker and Sons in 1981, which was acquired by the distillery giant Allied Dominic in 1987. When Allied Dominic was bought by Pernod Ricard in 2005, the Maker's Mark brand was sold to Deerfield, Illinois-based Fortune Brands. Fortune Brands split in 2011, with its alcoholic beverage business becoming Beam Incorporated. In 2014, Beam Inc. announced its sale to Suntory, creating the 3rd largest distilled spirit maker in the world, Beam Suntory. News of the proposed sale included bourbon executives vowing the product taste won't change, and neither will the company's historic purity standards. That statement was likely on the back of a PR disaster the previous year. February 9, 2013, the company sent out a mass email announcing a plan to reduce the alcohol strength of the whiskey, citing supply issues as the reason for the change. The result of this change would have been to reduce the product from a 45% alcohol by volume, we're talking about the US bottles here, to 42%. Which would have stretched inventory by about 6%. Then, a couple of weeks later, the company said it had reconsidered its decision after receiving strong negative reaction from its customers, and that would continue to bottle the original strength. However, we still get hosed here in Australia and comes in at 40%. The main message being drawn by the decision of the producers of Maker's Mark bourbon to reverse track and undo plans to reduce its alcohol content is, don't mess with bourbon drinkers. But behind the decision is an interesting lesson in how the overarching strategic needs of big global companies can lead to bad decisions for lovers of the products under their umbrellas. One of the tricky things about making and selling good whiskey is that it takes time. Maker's is a blend that is around 6 to 7 years old, which means that the fine people at Maker's Mark Distillery in Loretto, Kentucky, and their corporate overlords, which is now called Beam Suntory, were having to make decisions in 2007 that determined how much Maker's Mark they would have to sell in 2013. And it would seem they guessed wrong. They didn't properly foresee the booming worldwide demand. Sales of the bourbon increased 14% in 2011 and 15% in 2012 as part of the broader trend of bourbon. The company seems not to have anticipated the degree of anger the move would prompt from loyal Maker's drinkers. And as their statement from Rob Samuels and Bill Samuels Jr. said, "You spoke, we listened, and we're sincerely sorry we let you down." So now we've learned a little bit about the history of Maker's Mark Distillery. How about we have a look at the bottles we're featuring in this month's box. So we're going to start off with the value pick, which is our base Maker's Mark. And look, I'll be stunned if people haven't had this before. We put it in there so we can really do a flight to compare Maker's Mark to the 46 to the cask strength and take you on a bit of a journey through that. So Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon made in batches of less than 1,000 gallons, which is around 19 barrels at a time. In Australia, it comes in at the 40% ABV. Its mash bill is 70% corn, 16% wheat, and 14% malted barley. So let's give it a shot. Describe that as a toffee colour. reasonable legs. Nothing too exciting, not bad. So you get a big blast of sweetness that immediately greets you. You get the vanilla, the caramel, the brown sugar, a little bit of fruit like strawberry present there as well. The nose is actually surprisingly strong for a 40% bourbon. Unfortunately, right out of the bottle, it also gives a bit of an ethanol smell, but thankfully that dissipates over time and further reveals its sweet core. It's a very nice start, and it's actually quite surprising on how enjoyable it is. So that palate is decidedly less sweet than the nose alludes to, but nevertheless it's still pleasant and unassuming. The toffee, vanilla and oak all come through with fainter hits of some toasted nut and cinnamon. Overall, bit thin, but a buttery mouthfeel that goes down smooth. It's enjoyable, but not mind-blowing. That finish, at first the thinness of the bourbon makes the finish almost non-existent, but then it comes bouncing back. I wouldn't necessarily call the finish hot, but I wouldn't call it meek either. The palate's flavours that carry over into the finish are by no means deep and layered, but overall they're pleasant and they're really hard to find fault with. So that's our Makers, our value pick. Let's now have a look at the Makers 46. So the Makers 46, it comes in at 47% ABV. It doesn't have an age statement, but again it'll be around that 6 to 7 years. It's mash bill, 70% corn, 16% wheat, 14% malted barley again. Makers 46 starts off as a standard Makers mark, which is the wheated bourbon made in batches of less than 1,000 gallons, then heavily seared French oak staves are placed into just emptied standard Makers mark barrels, which are then refilled and returned to the warehouse to finish aging for an undisclosed amount of time, but it's estimated to be an additional 2 to 3 months. Released in 2010, Makers 46 was the first new major expression to be created at the Star Hill farm since the classic Makers went into production in 1953. When they were deciding how to do this wood finish bourbon, they tried dozens of different staves, making the cut prove challenging. Each wood sample was cut and seared in a number of different ways before being added to cask strength Makers mark. Eventually, the effects of the seared French oak aged for just the right amount of time and only in cooler temperatures dazzled. Only virgin French oak staves deliver 46 uniquely layered notes without the bitterness that often comes with additional aging. The wood finished experiments were the vision of Bill Samuels Jr., who worked alongside master distiller Kevin Smith and the independent stave company Makers' longtime cooperage. After finally finding the taste they were after, Bill Jr. learned the perfectly toasted French oak stave they used was on file with the independent stave company as stave profile number 46. How about we give it a shot? More of a dark toffee, that one. Again, medium legs. Upon lifting the glass, you're greeted with that familiar Makers profile, but with a bit of a twist. Makers 46 nose comes across as a bit heavier and deeper than what you'll get from the standard 46. All of the classic bourbon flavours are present, including strong hints of caramel, toasted oak and vanilla, along with buttery toffee and a touch of fresh toasted cinnamon bread. Really pleasant with a nice amount of depth to enjoy. The first thought that pops in my head upon tasting 46 is a kitchen on a Sunday morning. A nice buttery palate presents heavy oak, caramel, cinnamon, and a light, fresh baked wheat bread. The palate's flavours aren't as deep as the nose, however it's very well balanced and it's really enjoyable. In that finish you get a blast of spice containing buttered rum, hints of tobacco and leather, and aged oak that are all there. It seems to liven up from the palate and presents a more discernible flavour right up front. That being said, while it lingers for a while, it becomes more one-dimensional, consisting of mainly light hints of tobacco and leather. It's not bad, however, I just hope it would last just a little longer since it starts off really enjoyable. So now we move on to the star of our show, which is our Maker's Cask Strength. This particular one comes in at 54.35 ABV. Doesn't have an age statement, but again, it's around that 6 to 7 year old. It comes in at 7% corn, 16% wheat, and 14% barley, like all of our other Makers. So in 2014, Maker's Mark released a Maker's Mark Cask Strength bourbon in limited quantities, initially available only to consumers at their distillery gift shop. ABV fluctuates each batch, and it's somewhere between 53 and 58%, depending on what they lose in the angel share. The product was released on the global market in July of 2016. Maker's Mark Cask Strength is Maker's Mark with nothing added to get in the way. It's certainly not a beginner's bourbon. Maker's Mark Cask Strength is for the enthusiast who is after bolder flavours and higher proofs. After being screen filtered to remove wood pieces and char, Maker's Mark Cask Strength goes straight to the bottle. So, let's try it. There's amber colour on that. Good strong legs too. That's great. When you first crack a bottle of Cask Strength, you'll get a surprising amount of alcohol burn that overshadows the entire nose, but that dissipates after having the bottle open for a few days. On that nose, you'll get hints of cherries, cinnamon, vanilla underneath. It's overall on the sweet side. You can add a little bit of water to open it up if you want, and that'll allow some other scents to come out just a little more. The nose is in line with the standard Maker's Mark profile, but surprisingly not as potent as I would have thought for its proof. Let's give it a shot. It's a nice, full-bodied mouthfeel that coats your tongue. You get notes of caramel, toasted nuts and cinnamon to provide a wonderfully flavoured sip. Deeper hints of allspice, dark fruit and a touch of molasses round it out. The palate also follows the standard Maker's profile, but it has much more life in it. So on that finish, it's a medium to long finish. It has a great mix of sweet and spicy. They play off each other nicely as they keep the highs and lows in check. The tail end of the finish concludes with an earthy tone. It may be on the low end of proof for a cask strength bourbon, but it still packs a decent amount of heat. And again with this bourbon, adding just a few drops of water will allow you to focus more on the great flavours. Maker's Mark Cask Strength is one of the few barrel proof wheaters on the market. It may not be as potent as a 130 plus proof William LaRue Weller, but it captures some of that rare bourbon's best traits. High proof wheaters have a great interplay between sweet and spicy flavours that you don't always find in corn or rye heavy barrel proof bourbons. Simply put, they're delicious to sip. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the Maker's Mark Distillery, and I hope you're enjoying your journey. Cheers. No bloopers for you today.
That'll do.
Yeah.
That's in the video.
Yeah.
You're a long way to go.
Long way. In the 1960s and 70s, Maker's Mark was widely marketed. Widely. In the
I like wildly.
That square shape was inspired by Margie's collection of 19th century. So close. When Allied Domecq was bought by Pernod. You're not helping. You spoke, we listened, and we're sincerely so. You. Oh, the screw tap.
They're all. It's called that one.
You're fucking with me. Vanilla, along with buttery toffee and just a touch of fresh. You. So in 2014, Maker's Mask. There's your boy. It may not be as potent as the 130 plus proof Weller LaRue Weller. Lord.